So today we want to answer the question, what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament? You see, Malachi, the final writer in the Old Testament, his book was written around 450 BC. But the New Testament begins its narrative somewhere around 3 BC to 0, basically. So there's about a 450-year gap between the Old Testament and New Testament. What happens in that time frame? That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started on this. This is stuff that's not found in the Bible necessarily, so this is more world history type ideas. But it's important to understand what happened in that time frame to give us, one, perspective of what's going on in the world at this time, and two, to understand why was the world the way it was during the New Testament time period. So this is going to be kind of filling in that gap between what happened after the Old Testament and then how did that set things up to understand the world of the New Testament, which is what we're going to get into in our next videos, start the New Testament. So again, if you've watched all of our Old Testament videos, congratulations, this is awesome. This is a monumental time for you to make it through those videos and now get ready for transitioning into the New Testament. So let's kind of take a step back and look at this time period, this 450 years, from the perspective of the world. What was happening for the Jewish nation and what was happening across the world at this time, just so we can make sure we can fit together the Jewish history with world history and just kind of compare that. Because I want to help make more connections in your mind around the history side of things. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll get into the specifics of the Jewish history and how that helps us to think about New Testament timeframes, basically, as we get ready to do in the New Testament. So around 450, there's a couple of things that are really interesting that are going on. So around this time, the Greco-Persian Wars are ending, basically. So Persia has been pushing up into, if you remember, Persia is the one that took over from Babylon. Persia is what let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the temple and reestablishing the city of Jerusalem again. And so that's where Malachi and these other prophets have left off. They're trying to build the temple. They're trying to get it in place. They run into problems because the other neighboring countries, some of the Arab countries and other groups, are not happy with this. They don't want the Jews to have the same domination and power they had before, because they were a formidable foe. They were not a group to deal with. It was rare they lost a battle, basically, because of it. So while the Jews were down, they kept trying to kick them, basically, and make it hard for them to do things. So the Jews ended up stopping their work on the temple and working on survival, building the walls, doing defensive things, growing their crops, doing things like that to make life better. And if you remember from Zechariah, they got in trouble for this. And Zechariah's prophecy was about helping the people say, no, we need to trust in God and we need to build his temple and then worry about our survival second, because God will worry about our survival for us if we build his temple. And we want God on our side. If we try to do it ourselves, he's not there to help us. So that's what they're trying to do. Okay. So before we continue that story of the Jews, let's talk about world history. So at this time, Persia is the main dominating factor. They've been pushing up into Greece and that area and trying to take over that part of the world as well, as Persia still expanding and growing. Interestingly enough, shortly after those wars end, the Parthenon in Athens begins construction. That's around 447 BC. So the big Parthenon building that we only see a little bit of, they're trying to recreate it over there right now. That started construction shortly after Malachi's book, basically. The Peloponnesian Wars begin 431 BC between the Greek city-states. So Persia's pushing up into them. They're fighting amongst themselves. A lot of challenges up that way. Plato is born in 427 BC, so a little bit after this. The Peloponnesian War, of course, ends around 404 BC as well. So there's more consolidation up there. Socrates dies at 399 BC. If you remember, he's the one that he got in trouble and had to drink the potion. Oh no, sorry, that was somebody else. That was much later on. That's after Christianity. He had to do that one. Socrates was different. Aristotle's born in 384 BC. Uh, Alexander the Great comes in around 331 BC. He ends up taking over Persia. So we're going to get a little bit more of his story, because as Alexander the Great takes over, which most of us have heard of his stories, when he dominates Persia, that means he takes over Judea, and he now has he's influencing the the Jews in Jerusalem. So he's going to tie in a little bit more in there as well. So Alexander is growing. He's taking over everything. He's positioning himself as like the king. So he's dominating Persia and Babylonian area, Egypt as well, Greece and those places too. So let's talk about this for just a second. Okay, when Alexander the Great dies, okay, he was relatively young. He did a lot in a short period of time. He was relatively young in his life, and when he died, it was rather sudden. He was trying to push into India and died, basically. And so he was never super successful at getting over there. But he had conquered all the Middle East, up through over into Egypt, and that part of Africa, not quite into Europe, but starting to get up in that area as well. When he died, he had, if I remember right, 4 generals, I want to say. And if you're a historian and want to correct me on this, you're welcome to correct me in the comments. I believe he had four generals, and they basically couldn't figure out who's the successor to Alexander the Great, so they split the empire into 4 empires. Basically, the Seleucid Empire was one of the northern empires. The Ptolemy Empire was a southern empire that was over Egypt in that area. So the Jewish communities, Palestine was under the rule of the Ptolemies. Now, if you've ever studied Egyptian history, you'll know the Ptolemies are a part of the line of succession for Pharaoh in Egypt. So Ptolemies is the period of time when basically Greek-speaking, Greek-originating kings ruled Egypt. So the Ptolemies are Greek pharaohs, basically. So that's that time frame of Egyptian history is coming in at this point, just after Alexander the Great dies, basically. So those are there around 300 BC. The Great Pyramid in Cholula, Mexico, is being constructed. Now, Cholula, Mexico, the pyramid down there is one of the largest pyramids ever made in the world. Like, it's a little bigger than the Giza pyramids in Egypt. It starts to be built at 300 BC. So those are all those things that are happening on. If you're following Book of Mormon stories, if you're like, well, what is, for LDS viewers, what's going on in the Book of Mormon? This is 300 BC. These are around the time of the great wars that start to happen between Nephites and Lamanites and things. We're not quite to the time of Captain Moroni, but just the precursors of that time. So probably King Mosiah time frame might be one to consider in somewhere in there as well. If you follow Buddhism, then you realize that 273 BC, Ashoka becomes the emperor of the Maurya Empire. There's the Kalinga War and other things that happen around that time. So all this is going on. So India is growing, Buddhism is expanding. 221 BC, we get into, even in China, the Warring States period is over. The Qin Empire takes over. In 221 BC, the Qin Empire was the first empire of China, basically. So this is after the Xia and the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties were ended in the 100 Flowers, the Warring States period. The Qin Empire succeeds and takes over. So if you've ever heard of the Terracotta Army, the first Qing Empire, I believe Huang Di was the emperor's name. He is the one that built the Terracotta Army in this massive mausoleum he built for himself that basically made a scale model of the Qin Empire, which was all of China at the time, even preserving where the constellations were and things at the time. And he built that Terracotta Army and everything. That was his mausoleum for when he died, his tomb, basically. It wasn't found till 1947. In fact, a farmer was drilling a well, and his equipment ran into one of the terracotta soldiers, and that's when we found out it was there. They didn't realize it was even there because the emperor killed everybody who was part of building it, so that no one would know it was there. It was hidden so it wouldn't be raided by people later after he died. So that's beginning at 221 BC. Now the Qin Empire also helps to finish the Great Wall of China. So there was different sections that had been there before, but he built the bulk of it basically with the Qin Empire, as far as putting it into place and doing stuff, which is really cool. So that's Chinese history is moving forward with that final consolidations and ideas. In fact, 200 BC in the Han Dynasty, which was after the Qin Dynasty, was when paper was invented. They actually used to take bamboo and they would break it up and then boil it to get all the fibers to come off, then gather up the fibers, smash them flat, flay them out, flatten them, dry them, and then cut out a piece of paper out of them, basically trim off the edges. So paper was invented in China long before it was ever in Europe, basically. China has a lot of technological innovations that they gave the rest of the world through this time. So all that's happening as well in this time frame, basically. And so these empires in Middle East are still fighting against themselves. Now, also around this 250-ish BC time frame, we have these other empires are kind of falling apart. The old empires after Alexander the Great start consolidating and falling apart and having problems. We get the beginning of the next great empire in the Middle Eastern area, which is Rome. So they start to consolidate. The Greeks have consolidated to their area after the Persian conquests. Rome, all the city-states around Rome start pooling together, coming together. So they form a group. They go over with the Greeks. They start to spread out, start taking over these other empires as well. So Rome is beginning during this time as well and starting to become a world power, basically. Around 167 BC, we're going to take some time here in a minute to talk about what's called the Maccabean Revolt. So the Jews get sick of the Seleucid Empire controlling them. They originally were under the Ptolemies, the group that controlled Greeks that controlled Egypt. Because Palestine was on the border of the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemy Empire, it was lots of fighting that happened in that area. So they really struggled. Judea struggled a lot to really become a big power again, because these other countries were fighting. These other nations were always going at it. The Seleucid Empire eventually takes over Judea and really tries to get rid of the Jewish religion, basically around 200-ish BC. And then around 167 BC, we have what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And we're going to talk more about that. That's the Jews revolting against the Seleucid Empire. So they get rid of them, and then they kind of make an alliance with Rome, which helps them in the short term to get rid of the Seleucid Empire and have a little bit more autonomy and freedom. But then later, that becomes a problem, which leads into the New Testament times with Rome taking over. So shortly after this, of course, there's the Punic Wars, the Third Punic War between Rome and Carthage. That happens. A lot of stuff that's going on. A lot of things are happening. China has become a major empire. They're growing. They're doing things. And China, the Qin dynasty had an army that was way bigger than Rome. There's no way Rome could have ever stood a chance against China. If China wanted to, they would have conquered the world, but they didn't. They had their own reasons for that. So these things are happening a lot, okay? All this is going on. Rome is becoming the world power, dominating everything. India is still growing. Buddhism is spreading through China as well as through India and those other areas. People pushing up into European areas as well. More and more, there's the barbarians that come through later on. Remember, the Mongols come over at some point and interact with Rome, blackmail Rome, basically. That's shortly before the Black Plague and all that happens. So the Rome starts to dominate at this point, basically. And so we get the challenges with all of that happening. And so Judea becomes a little independent. They are given some autonomy because they're seen as so different. It was like against their religion to be in an army. And so they didn't join the Roman army, even though you're required to. That was Roman law. Well, they gave an exception for the Jews, but Jews wouldn't participate in voting. They didn't have political representation in Rome. So there was that trade-off. They wouldn't become Roman. They wanted to stay Jewish. So the Romans are like, okay, fine, you can stay Jewish, but you're not getting a vote in the politics, basically. So there was good and bad in that trade-off. And that's the world of Rome dominating, of all these things happening that we go into the New Testament with. So that just kind of gives you this higher level view of all these changes and challenges that are happening across the world at the same time these things are happening in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's jump in and talk more about just the history of the Jews in this time frame. Okay, so at the end of the book of Malachi, Persia, if you remember, has come in, taken over Babylon, and has allowed the Jews to go home. So we have two types of Jews that are going back to Jerusalem. Okay, there's a group that was left in Jerusalem back in the Babylonian conquest time. These were the people that were the day laborers. They weren't wealthy. They were the dirt poor people. They were just seen as riffraff, and they were left in Jerusalem to fend for themselves. Some of them migrate into other parts of the world, Arab countries, up into Greece and other places too. Some go into Egypt. Those got destroyed later on. So some stayed in Jerusalem and tried to farm and eke out a little bit of a living on their homeland. Some left the area for better places, for easier to develop. They had more economies, trade, commerce, things like that happening. These other nearby nations. So they stayed. They're there. Okay. Then 70 years goes by after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Then the Persians come in and take over Babylon and say, guess what? You guys can go home now. So there's a new migration of Jews going from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So they're coming back. And the challenge is there's people that have stayed in Jerusalem. So the people that stayed in Jerusalem have done their best to try to remember the ordinances, remember, what happened and what it was like to be a Jew, and have the rights and the Torah and law of Moses and things. Then you've got this group of people. Now 70 years has transpired. This group back, most of these people coming back were not alive when Jerusalem was destroyed the first time. So these are the next generation of Jews coming out of Babylon that have been Babylonified and coming back. So they're bringing Babylonian culture and language and things with them. And now these two groups of Jews that have stayed roughly the same, and then Jews that went to Babylon are now coming together, and they have to reunify themselves. And so there's some challenges and problems that happen. We don't get into that in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is more, again, about these prophets that are talking about, let's rebuild the temple, let's restore the city, let's do these things. But there's a lot of stuff that these people have to work out. So Aramaic comes with the Jews from the exile. Aramaic is a Semitic language that was from Babylon, basically, that was brought with them. So the ones that stayed speak Hebrew. The ones that come from Babylon do Hebrew and Aramaic. So now we've got a lot of people who aren't super familiar with Hebrew, but almost Aramaic is their first language. Hebrew is a second language. So there's an intermingling, and so scribes have to translate the documents into Aramaic so that the other Jews can have them as well. And so there's different cultures, different ideas that are coming together. That's the world that we see Zechariah and Malachi and these prophets in. Okay, that's what's happening. So after the prophets, they're still building the temple. Okay, the governor of Jerusalem and that area is Zerubbabel. They rebuild the temple, not to the full extent it was when Solomon's temple was around, but pretty close. It's not quite as opulent as Solomon's temple, but it was pretty decent. So now Jerusalem is reestablished. They have a temple. They're trying to restore their ordinances, their rights, their teachings, those kinds of things also. So they're trying to build their nation back up, basically, while all this other stuff that's happening. Okay. Now, as Persia controls that area, Persia gave the Jews a lot of autonomy to do their own thing. I think Persia helped them out a little bit against some of their rival countries, but that was more relying on God to help them out to to still be able to survive and to do things. Um, One of the things that happened at this time is as Persia's pushing up into Greece, Macedonia becomes a big deal. The king of Macedon's son, named Alexander, is Alexander the Great. He takes over Persia. So this is about 100 years after Malachi. So we said, Malachi's book was written around 450 BC. So remember, around 350 BC, Alexander the Great comes in. Alexander the Great comes in and takes over the whole Persian Empire. Takes over Egypt, takes over the whole Middle East area, pushes up into Europe a little bit, goes over to more of the Balkan areas, tries to get into India, and that's when he gets sick and dies. So he's not super successful at dominating over in the East. But he made a heck of a name for himself. We all learn about him in world history through school, Alexander the Great. One thing that transitions and happens to the Jews during that time frame is what's known as Hellenization. So Hellenization is this idea of Greekifying things. Okay, so when you ever hear the word Hellenization, it means we are Greekifying stuff. So Greek culture starts to spread, starts to become a dominant culture through Alexander the Great's empire. And so in Judea, in the Palestine area, they're under a lot of pressure to adopt this. More so the people who want to play in the greater world economy, they need to Hellenize. So the wealthy, the business class of the Jews, they need to do, there's a lot of pressure on them to Hellenize, to adopt Greek philosophy, to adopt Greek cultures and ideas, to be more in the world, basically. So that kind of clashes with Judaism, and that over time that creates some debate as culture changes, religious perspectives start to shift and change. So Jewish religion becomes a little more Hellenized at that time, not completely taken over from Hellenistic ideas, but there's interpretations that become more Greek, if you will. This is when they start to get more, as the Jews spread out among the areas of Persia, they get into Greek areas, and so they live among the Greeks and do more there as well. So they eventually have to translate the scriptures into Greek. So that's the Septuagint, the Greek translations of the scriptures, basically, for people. So all that's happening now. Alexander the Great, remember, he dies rather short. He has a short time as this world empire guy. And we talked about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids go back and forth, okay, in fighting for that area. Most of the time they spend under Ptolemy rule, so Egypt rules Jerusalem and that Palestinian area. But eventually the Seleucids take over. And I'm trying to remember when that was. Let me see if I can find the time frame when the Seleucids came in. Let's see. It was around 175, 200, 175 BC, somewhere right in there is, around 200 BC, the Seleucids came in and captured Judea. So they came in and captured Judea, and so now the Seleucids are ruling from Syria, so north of Jerusalem in that area, basically. They capture the area, they take it over, and they're not quite as autonomous with the Jews. They kind of want the Jews to do things their way. So around 175 BC, the Seleucid Empire has a king named Antiochus, Antiochus the Fourth. He has a name that is very ingrained in Jewish history. You see, Antiochus comes in, and the Seleucids were a polytheistic philosophy. They were more like worship of Baal and other gods and things, and getting into more Greek ideas as well of polytheism. So Antiochus is seen, for a lot of the Jews at the time, and Antiochus is kind of seen as what we would call today the Antichrist. He's the Nero of Old Testament, basically, of the later Old Testament time. He's the guy that hates the Jews, and unfortunately, because the Roman Empire is now growing and dominating, his empire is under threat, basically, from being taken over by Rome. So he decides he needs to consolidate things and rebuild his empire and solidify it. So he's ready to go. The Jews always have wanted to be their own people. They want to be separate from the other cultures out there. Some of the times, in the Old Testament, sometimes they want to be like everybody else. But at this time frame, because they've been dominated, they want to have their individualism more. So they are often pushing back against what the Seleucids want to do. They don't want to take the Seleucid culture and ideas. So Antiochus comes in and says, you know what? These Jews are a thorn in our side. We just need to make them do what we want. So he takes his army, moves down in there. He basically outlaws a lot of Jewish traditions and ideas. He bans like circumcision, for instance. And so his army goes house by house and inspects male babies. If your male baby has been circumcised, they kill your baby on the spot. And you have to watch, basically, as they murder your baby. So they make people eat pork. They force people to worship God. So he goes down, he basically marches into the temple in Jerusalem, puts his idols in there, kind of pushes the idols, that because there's no idols to Jehovah necessarily, but he puts his idols on the altar and he makes the people eat pork, which is against the law of Moses. So he's trying to impose his religion on them in a very violent way. So the Jews hate this. But what can you say when this invading army is imposing upon you? So they kind of are in a rock and a hard place, because it's basically, you follow us or we kill you. That's all you had. And I'm sure there's a lot of Jews that went, kill me, because I'm not going to do that. There were a lot of Jews that went, well, it's better to live and I can act this way, but I don't have to believe it inside. I still be Jewish inside and do what I can in secret. That's for Jewish ideas, but then outwardly make it look like I'm following them just to follow along. I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong argument in that. Do I live Jewish secretly and then outwardly look like I'm worshiping these other gods just to just to kind of save face with the kingdom and the laws of the land, or do I rebel and get killed? I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong in there. There's just the choice you decide to make, basically, and whatever you feel the Spirit guides you to do. So they push back hard against the Seleucid Empire at one point. There is a gentleman that just gets fed up with this. He's sick of all this stuff. Now at this time the Jews have kind of broken into different groups. Okay, there's the Pharisees, which are more progressive in their ideas, and basically then there's the Sadducees that tend to be more, we need to follow the law, we need to do the written word. So they're more conservative Jews. So you've got your progressive Jews, conservative Jews, then you have Essenes, which is a whole nother group that kind of breaks off. They become the religiously zealot groups. Like they are so devout to Judaism that they would rather die than do anything else. So they kind of break off. That's where we get more of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes kind of break off, go over to Qumran, do their own thing over there. Part of them go over that way. So that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls come into play. And that's around 250, 200 BC time frame as well. They kind of break off. So that's that time frame. So what happens basically is around 167, so just several years into Antiochus's reign, so it's not very long, there's a priest by the name of Mattathias that he finally says, enough's enough, this is stupid, I'm not following this Seleucid stuff, this is dumb. So basically he and his 5 sons, they killed the priest and the guards that are making them eat pork and defy Jewish law. So they kill him, and then they flee because, of course, now they're fugitives of the law for the Seleucid Empire. So they flee up into the mountains of Judea to hide, and then they call for a revolt against the Seleucid Empire, the overlords of them, basically. So some of the Jews follow them. They go out there, they create kind of a small insurgent army, and they start fighting against the Seleucid Empire and going against them. So this group kind of becomes a bit of a terrorist group against the Seleucids, basically. So a lot of insurgent tactics, surprise attacks, little things where I can hit them and then get out of there and escape quickly so I don't get caught. They just start making daily life for the Seleucid army bad. One of Mattathias' sons, whose name was Judah the Maccabee, or Judas Maccabeus. He got this name Maccabeus because it came from the word hammer. So he's Judah the Hammer. And he basically leads this revolt. We know it today as the Maccabean Revolt or the Hasmonean Revolt, because he was a part of the Hasmonean family, basically. They revolt against the Seleucids, and they are quite victorious at pushing the Seleucid Empire out of Judea. Now, the Seleucids were already weakening and struggling anyways because of the conquest of Rome, but they were successful. In fact, the Maccabeans end up basically pushing the Seleucids out and taking over Judea and kind of running things, basically become the de facto government themselves. They end up making an alliance with Rome to help with this autonomy and push out the Seleucids. So that was a good thing at the time. But as Rome grows and evolves, that kind of turned bad for the Jews later on. As we know, getting into New Testament times, the Romans are still over them, and they kind of hate their Jewish overlords, or Roman overlords, basically. We see that come out quite a bit through the New Testament times. So that was 161. They established an alliance with Rome, basically, and trying to become their independent state. And then they got to a certain point, and then Rome's like, no, you can't be more independent than that. You're part of our empire. You need to follow our laws. So it was limited in how it could run. So the interesting thing about this period, okay, so they have a temple. This is where we get more of a rise of synagogue coming up. So during this whole time frame, there's less emphasis on temple worship as far as it being the key main factor. They have the temple. You still go to the temple to do things, but your normal Sabbath day worship is more about synagogue, which is more of getting together to talk, getting together in the church rather than necessarily at the temple itself, basically. And so that's a big trend that we see. Okay, the Pharisees and Sadducees and the Essenes still have power. They kind of religiously divide up Judea, basically, do you follow? Which version of Judaism do you follow, basically? But they work with each other to share power in the government and in the groups. Some of the richer families kind of become the domineering families. During this time frame, we have a family that is more Gentile in nature, Greek in nature, where Herod the Great comes in. So as Rome establishes the area, they give Herod's family, basically Herod, his family, rule over Judea. So Herod the Great and his three sons, he divides some of the land out under his three sons to rule that area. So that's where we get the Herods in the New Testament from. So all this is culminating to transition into New Testament not New Testament Christianity, New Testament Judaism. Okay, so less emphasis on temple as the primary sole place you go, more emphasis in the synagogue, local churches where you go to read Torah, you read scriptures, and most of the people are illiterate, so it was up to the priest to recite the scriptures, and then the people would hear them often enough and they would memorize them. And that's how they would remember their scriptures, because they couldn't read them, so they would memorize the spoken version of the scriptures, basically. And that's that's how they would do things. So they didn't know a lot of the scriptures, but they knew several key parts. So because there was so much illiteracy, they kind of took the whole law of Moses, the whole Torah, and said, okay, we're not going to make you memorize the whole thing, but we're going to take key parts out to remember. So certain quotes are common for the Jews to memorize, and those are the ones they would focus on memorizing for their rights and privileges and festivals and those kinds of things as well. So Rome is now the new dominating factor. Judaism is just moving along in their day-to-day activities. Now Rome goes through a civil war period as well, just before the New Testament times come in. But then we end up getting into, as we get into the more Roman times, like around 0 BC, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which Roman emperor it was. Oh man, I don't know if I can look it up quick enough. Anyways, peace actually starts to settle over the Roman Empire. So they have a civil war, they get consolidated after the Civil War, and that's kind of when the idea of Caesar having an emperor of Rome, if you will, comes into play. And so that's when we get the rise of the Caesar, is before Christ's time. And then there ends up being peace. Like the time that Christ is born is some of the most peaceful time period of Roman history. It's amazing. That whole time period when Christ was alive was like some of the most peaceful times in Roman history, basically. So a lot of peace starts to settle. So economic development starts to happen more, growth, progress in the arts and sciences and things start to happen more as Rome is taken over, being the dominant world power at the time. So that's where we've gotten to. Okay, that's where we're moving in this direction, where the New Testament's going to take over and run. So that's what we want to be thinking about as we get into the New Testament. So this is what's been happening. I know this has been a lot. I've been just hitting on a lot of highlights of things. If you have questions, put it in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. It's a fascinating time of history to study, and hopefully I've given you enough information about this time period between the two testaments that you can go through some rabbit holes to look up the Maccabean Revolt, Antiochus the Fourth, changes into synagogues and the Essenes and things that happen for Jewish history as well as the other dominating factors of world history too. So hopefully that helps you to bridge what was happening. There's a lot going on. Now it's time, we've set the stage to start talking about the New Testament, which we're going to get to in our next video. So please like and subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it out with others. The New Testament is next, and I look forward to working with you more as we study the New Testament in our next videos.